Hello friends, I'm Michael Kingswood, and this is Story Time, where I read stories that I wrote that you will love. And on Tuesdays here, we have been going through my heroic fantasy novel, Glimmer, which is the first book in my Glimmer Chronicles series, which is now up to 7 books and a number of short stories with more to come. Super fun series. If you haven't already checked it out, you really should. And it's a good thing you're here because we're going through the first book here and on Substack and over on the Arcade and Comics blog. And this way to hopefully entice you into liking it, buying the books and seeing and reading more. It's all part of my nefarious plot. So this week we are doing chapter 6. It's a chapter called Nightlife. Though I wrote this book, I am not reading it. For this one, we hired a voice actor a few years back who did a great job, and you're going to enjoy it. So let's just get right into the chapter.
Chapter 6. Nightlife. After a bath, Julian felt much better. The previous few weeks had been draining, and had filled him with tension he almost hadn't realized. To say nothing of grime from the road and his physical injuries. He could have soaked all night into blazes with going back down to the tap room, but eventually the bathwater cooling and his stomach growling forced him to get up. Raedric had already finished dressing and had gone back downstairs when Julian returned to their room from the baths, so he lingered just long enough to change out his bandages and don a fresh set of clothes before heading downstairs himself. It was a lot easier on his leg, going down than coming up, no big surprise there. He found Raedric sitting at a table not far from the bar with Molly and a pretty blonde-haired girl. They spied him as he approached and waved him over with a trio of smiles. As he took a seat at the table, Raedric spoke in an excited voice. "Julian, this is Lonnie Millens, Molly's daughter." Lonnie was even prettier up close than she had been from afar. She was not terribly tall, best as he could tell with her sitting down, but her warm smile, rosy cheeks, full bosom, and intelligent gaze was enchanting. Julian smiled broadly as he shook hands with her and brought his lips down to the back of her hand. "The pleasure is all mine," he said. Lonnie giggled, glancing aside at Raedric. "You weren't kidding," she said in a melodic alto. Julian looked askance at his friend. "What did you say to her?" "Only that you're a rascal who likes to flirt," Molly said. "Great. Well, that's not true." He smiled a bit more broadly. "I'm not at all a rascal." Both ladies laughed merrily for a moment, then Molly stood up. "I'll go check on dinner. It should be ready by now. Please make yourself comfortable, Julian. Tonight's on me." That was music to his ears. Dinner was outstanding. Braised beef atop seasoned rice, with steaming bread fresh from the oven and a very nice bottle of wine from the Pyrene Valley, followed by a large slice of a kind of cake that Julian had never eaten before. It was unbelievably delicious, though, and was a fitting end to the meal. Conversation was muted at first, since Julian and Raedric were both famished and did little more than shovel food down their throats. But eventually, after the plates were all pushed aside, the talk picked up a bit. Unfortunately for Julian, however, the conversation quickly degenerated into Raedric and Lonnie exchanging cherished anecdotes from their childhood dalliance, or whatever it was. Julian quickly began to feel that his presence was no longer needed, especially after Molly left to tend to business, so he begged off to run to the privy. Neither Raedric nor Lonnie objected. In truth, he was feeling the call of nature, but when he returned to the taproom after satisfying that particular need, he looked over at the table and saw the two of them engrossed in conversation and lost in each other's eyes, and he turned away toward the bar. Far be it from him to block his friend's chance to do well with a pretty lady. Julian slid onto a stool next to an older man in a faded wool cloak and tried to flag down the bartender. The man was busy at the far end of the bar, though, so Julian was forced to wait. "You're one of them 2 newcomers, the ones who brought the thief in this evening, right?" The man sitting next to him had turned to look at him and addressed him in a tone of friendly curiosity. "Sure am. Julian." He held out his hand and received a good firm handshake in response. "Horace, damn good to meet you, boy. About time someone did something about them scumbags." "It wasn't much, really. Just defending ourselves is all." Horace snorted. "Way I hear tell, you 2 boys fought off a dozen of them bandits without taking a scratch. Don't sound like nothing to me." Julian looked incredulously at him for a moment, then burst out laughing. "First of all, there were 6. Secondly," he gestured toward his thigh, then held up his bandaged right hand and pointed to his nose. "I took more than a couple scratches. Now, my friend over there," he nodded in Raedric's direction. "He got off without a hitch, but I had the tougher task in that fight." Horace snorted again. "Well, whatever. Point is, you boys did real good, and I'm proud to know you." "Thanks, Horace. I appreciate that." The bartender finally made it over to Julian, and he ordered another tankard of mulled wine. But when the bartender brought the drink, Horace spoke up again. I'm paying for that, Rolf. In fact, this boy and his friend don't pay for another drink tonight. Understand? It's on me. Rolf looked quizzically at Horace, then shrugged.
However you want to play it, Horace. I'll put it on your tab.
That's really not necessary, Julian began, but Horace waved him to silence. The hell it ain't. You boys did us a public service today. Least I can do is buy you a couple drinks. Julian realized arguing any further would be futile. Besides, who was he to pass up free drinks, especially if they were for doing something that really wasn't anything special at all? Smiling, he raised his tankard to Horace and said, In that case, thank you, kind sir. A movement at the other end of the room drew Julian's eye, and he lost track of what he was about to say. The woman descending the stairs from the second floor was hard to miss. Long, wavy dark hair, a perfectly hourglass-shaped figure, and a pretty face. She would have stood out anywhere. But here, the fine fabric of her dress and the glitter of precious metal and gems reflecting off the firelight from her wrists, ears, and neck stood out and marked her as a lady of means. Julian couldn't help but stare. Horace noticed, of course, and followed Julian's gaze with his own. Then he burst out laughing. Forget about it, boy. That girl ain't got no interest in the likes of you and me. Is that so? What makes you say that? Horace looked at him as though he was daft. Well, look at her. Rolling his eyes, Julian returned Horace's gaze with one of incredulity. That's it? He asked, and realized that he had just let a healthy dose of annoyance slip into the tone he was using to address the man who was buying his drinks. He cleared his throat and looked away, but if Horace was put out or offended, it didn't show in his demeanor or in how he treated the question. A well-set-up lass like her probably comes from nobility, has a rich husband, or is looking for one. That's it. The woman walked, or rather flowed, over to an empty table near one of the fireplaces and sat down. Julian noted with interest that she sat with her back to the wall. She was a careful one, or so it seemed. She had barely settled into her chair when a server hurried over. They exchanged quick words, then, making a slight curtsy, the server made her way quickly back to the bar. Let's see if your theory is true, Julian said to Horace. Then he stood and moved over to where the server stood waiting for the woman's drink. Horace chuckled. Your funeral, boy. Julian reached the server as she was reaching for the drink. Moving quickly, he got his hand in ahead of her and snatched it up, then tossed a few coins onto the bar. Hey! I've got this one, thanks, Julian said over his shoulder as he moved away from the bar. The mixture of chagrin and bemusement on the server's face was classic. He reached the woman's table quickly, only having to pause once to avoid being run over by a large drunk fellow on his way to the privy. She was reading from a small leather-bound book as he approached. From a distance, she looked attractive. Close up, she was gorgeous, stunning even. Suddenly struck by a big case of nerves, Julian almost turned around and went back to Horace at the bar. None of that. Taking a deep breath, Julian squared his shoulders and strode the last few paces to the woman's table. Your drink, my lady, he said as he placed her glass onto the table in front of her. The woman didn't look up. She just murmured, Thank you, and held out a coin. A silver coin. Again, Julian was tempted to just walk away, after pocketing the money, of course. Instead, he sat down in an empty chair at her table. No need for that. I covered this one. She looked up from her book and frowned. Julian moved ahead before she could say anything. I'm Julian Hinderbrook, and your name is? He put on his most charming smile as he spoke, one that normally made the maiden swoon. None of your business. She inserted a place mark, snapped her book shut, and cast it down on the table with an expression of disgust. It's bad enough I'm stranded in this flyspeck of a town in the middle of nowhere. I don't need to be accosted by every bumpkin in the place. Thank you for the drink. Now, off with you. She made a shooing gesture that carried entire levels of contemptuous dismissal. Julian had to force his smile not to compress into a scowl. Why, that conceited little... I'm no bumpkin. He knew his tone was frosty, but he couldn't help it, and, frankly, she deserved it. The woman rolled her eyes. Yes, of course. How could I have missed it? You're a cultural minister from Tyrash. Sarcasm dripped from her words. It didn't help that Julian had no idea where Tyrash was. All of a sudden, he felt stupid, and from her expression, he looked the part, too. She shook her head slightly, then picked up her book again and opened it up to her place. Making another shooing gesture, she began to read again. A lesser man would have departed at this point. Julian decided to make one last attempt. Look, I'm just trying to be friendly here. As he began speaking, the woman looked up at him through narrowed eyes that sparkled with irritation. She cupped her hand in front of her mouth as though she was going to blow him a kiss. But when she blew out, instead of a kiss, a plume of flame leapt out toward him. Julian shouted a curse and pushed himself backwards, his hands flying upwards to protect his face. He leaned way back and his chair teetered for a moment, then fell over onto the ground, taking him with it. The flame burned out very quickly. It did not even reach his position where he had been sitting. But the flash of heat was real. Very real. Julian lay there on the floor for a moment, stunned. A sudden silence descended on the tap room as Julian pushed himself up to his feet. Every eye was fixed on him and the woman. His face warm with embarrassment and, from the brief heat of the flame, he fixed the woman with a glare as he brushed himself off. Then he turned and walked away. From the corner of his eye, he saw her give a mocking little wave as he left. He did not look back. Horace looked as stunned as Julian felt when he returned to the bar. All the same, he managed to smirk as he said, "Told you so." "You could have warned me that she was a mage," Julian replied angrily before he downed a large drink of his wine. Horace sniffed. "She ain't no mage. Women ain't allowed to study magery, boy. Wonder how and where she picked that up." Julian shrugged and drank again, finishing off his tankard. Slamming it down on the bar, he scowled over at the woman for a moment. "Whatever. I've had enough for one day. Good meeting you, Horace." Horace chuckled and shook Julian's hand again. "Don't let it get to you. Good night." Julian nodded and made his way to the stairs. As he began to ascend, he looked back over his shoulder for a moment. The woman was still there, looking just as pretty as before, and just as separate. For a heartbeat, he imagined their eyes met, and she smiled briefly.
As Wayne Gretzky said, you miss every shot you don't take. Hats off to Julian for taking the shot. Too bad it didn't work out. Oh well. It's kind of a fun scene. I liked that, writing that one. It's one that I had in mind from early on when I started writing the book. And I think it turned out pretty well. Let me know down below what you thought. If you want to know what happens next in the story, of course, come back next week. On Tuesdays, we'll be continuing on this book through the rest of, most of the next 6 months at least. And then, you can, of course, go buy the book. Go buy the book, all the stories, read the series. It's good, fun stuff. I think you'll like it. And, it would be super awesome for all involved. That said, come back on Saturday, because on Story Saturdays, we read other stories of mine that I have written, mostly shorter works. Lots of fun stuff we do there each week. Different type of genre each time, depending on which story I go through. I've got a whole bunch of them that I wrote, and I'm pretty much going through in order. This year, we're going through a collection of stories that I wrote a couple of years ago that are getting through. We're into volume 3 of that, and we'll be getting through the rest of that. We're through most of the rest of this year as well. And of course, subscribe to the channel because we do other things around here. We talk music, current events, whatever comes to mind, and generally have a good time. Thanks for joining me on this chapter. I hope to see you next time. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do. All right, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, Kingswood, I love that story. How can I buy your books? Great question. Here's the answer. Best way to buy my books is to come over to my site, michaelkingswood.com/store. That will bring you to this place, which is my company's store where you can get books, merchandise, all kinds of great stuff that I've set up. And but you're wondering how it works. Well, here, let's check out Glimmer Chronicles, which is my heroic fantasy series that I've talked a lot about. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. It's a super fun series. Everything you would want. You should start with Glimmer, which is the first book. Come over here to Glimmer. It'll load up. Hey, look at that. You get the book description, links to other books in the series, great stuff. And you can pick the format you want. You got ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. Not everything I've written is an audiobook yet, but almost everything's a trade paperback and everything's an ebook. But like, hey, I know what you're thinking. Hey, I'm buying from you. How do I get the ebook? There's a service that I work with called Book Funnel. When you buy from my site, they will send you a link. That link will lead you to a page where they will walk you through how to load your ebook onto the device you're choosing, or you can just download it to computer and do whatever you want with it. So that way it's easy peasy. Maximum profit for me, all kinds of fun for you. But I know a lot of you guys, you like your Kindles, you like your other things, and you want to go straight to the retailer, and that's fine. You can come over here to michaelkingswood.com/books2read, the number 2, and I have this handy dandy universal book-like aggregator page set up. You can scroll through, look at all my stories, all my books, and pick which one you want, and then go from there. Here's how it works. Let's do Glimmer Vale again. So Glimmer Vale, first book in the series, you click on it, you get this thing, you get the book description, you get all other books in the series, and you say, get it now. Okay, get it now. Look what happens. Every retailer where you can find it is here. You can pick the one that you like best and say, okay, cool. Well, let's say I wanted to buy it in, I don't know, let's just say Kobo, because why not? Click on it. And then it'll ask you, is this your favorite store? If so, you set it. So every time you come back, you don't have to choose. It'll just go take you to your favorite store. But let's just, you don't have to do that. Well, we're going on to Kobo. Hoo-yah. Hey, look at this. Here it is on the Kobo site. People like it. People have bought it. Good stuff. Links to other things of mine. And, or you can do one of the other stores that you like. Either way, you get the book you like. I get money. It's all good.